Europe at large. So today we'll be looking at the green hydrogen policy development in India and opportunities for sort of application at the industrial scale in India, and not just for domestic, but also see how we can scale it up for export to other parts of the world. So the way we have today's session structured is that we have the anchor and the main speaker is Abhinav Jindal from the Power Management Institute, and he has written a paper recently with two other authors on sort of the cost economics of green hydrogen production in India and whether or not they can sort of truly compete with the other shades of hydrogen. And then what should be sort of the policy interventions that the government should necessarily take if they were to sort of assure this space in India. And complementing Abhinav would be Vaibhav, who is from PricewaterhouseCoopers, who is also working closely with the EU-India Clean Energy Climate Partnership, particularly the Green Hydrogen Program. And he would sort of throw some more light on the cross-continental collaboration and probably challenge Abhinav to one or two questions. And then, of course, joining me would be my colleague and co-host, Lucilla, where we'll sort of step in and see how we can sort of bridge the knowledge between the two continents, both from multi-perspective views. So if you have any questions, and for those of you also looking at us online, do make sure that you drop your questions and we will address it at the later stage of today's session. So without further ado, Abhinav, I would love to give you the floor so that you can present to us the findings of the recent paper that you've published. And then from there, we'll take the floor.
Thank you, Shweta. Hi, everyone. Uh, very happy to be part of FSR Global Debates discussion webinar. And we are trying to focus on a very topical idea of scaling green hydrogen in Indian context, and to see how green hydrogen can be made cost effective going forward. And during the course of our discussion, we will be pointing as to not only what are the key aspects of our research, but how our research addresses the key gaps which are so-called impediments in scaling green hydrogen. And can I share my screen? Yeah.
You may.
So before we get going, just wanted to mention that it has been our endeavor to track all the emerging technologies. We began with a number of renewable energy technologies such as solar PV, and then we moved on to battery storage. We had a paper which is titled "At Scale Adoption of Battery Storage in Indian Industry." From then, we moved on to now green hydrogen, and going forward we are also exploring scale adoption of pump storage. So the idea is to see how these emerging technologies can be scaled in India, right, cost effectively, and what are the enabling policies. So in a series of such papers, we have explored how green hydrogen can be scaled in India. And as you would see, we are analyzing three key aspects which will help scale green hydrogen. First is the costs, then the subsidies, and third, the policies. So before we get going, just a brief idea of where I'm coming from. I am a PhD in economics. I am also an honorary fellow at the University of Oxford. I have close to 2 decades experience being associated with a few management institutes in India as visiting faculty. And I have over 50 publications to my credit with a number of institutions of eminence like Oxford, Stanford, Imperial, and the World Bank, including this publication. So the main authors who developed this research is obviously me leading it. Then we have Dr. Girish Srimali, who is at Oxford and also at SMU, Singapore Management University. Then we have Nishant Tiwari. He's a very important player in the Indian green hydrogen space. He was earlier associated as officer on special duty to the Honorable Minister of Power. And he was very instrumental in devising the green hydrogen policy. The first policy came out, and is at presently doing his MBA from Stanford, Harvard. right? So these are, so our paper had a mix of policymakers, hardcore researchers, and industry experts. The outline of this presentation is going to be as follows. We first going to see what are the key research gaps in the overall gray and academic literature. What are
Okay.
the key questions? Yeah,
So may I just ask you to make the presentation in full screen mode? Yeah. Thank you.
it appears to be full screen at my end. Yeah. Is it any better now?
Not yet. It's still showing us in slide mode, not yet in full screen.
Okay, so probably I'll stop sharing the screen and let me try it.
I could also share screen if you would like me to.
Yeah, yeah, just one second. Let's figure this out. Let me know if this works. Does this work?
No, it's the same. Okay. Let me probably just quickly
Yeah.
share screen. So I don't want to break your. Oh,
Yeah. Do you have the presentation?
yes, I do.
Okay. Yeah, so we
Yes.
were, I think, on slide number fourth. Yeah. So, thank you, Shweta. So, apologies. So, after addressing the three key research questions, which I'll be answering in a while, I just wanted to upfront tell you what are the key contributions in terms of the highlights of this paper. And then we will maybe touch upon the methods and data very cursorily and the key findings, which I'll be very happy to discuss with the audience and get their inputs also. And the last two aspects, which I feel is the most novel contribution of the paper, how we see uh, devising cost effective subsidy options. And finally, what do we mean by hydrogen portfolio standards, the new term that we have coined. Uh, yeah. Moving ahead. So, I mean, we found out that there were a number of studies globally as well as in India, which talk about the levelized costing for green hydrogen. But there were literally no studies for India which talk about scaling green hydrogen using cost effective subsidy options. So we tried to see how we can devise policies which help us scale green hydrogen cost effectively. And the idea was to analyze probably all the salient subsidy options in terms of their costing and then to suggest the most plausible as well as cost effective option. Second, I mean, cost effectiveness is definitely an imperative. What is also needed is to see that this gets implemented on the ground. And for that, we need to have a sense of what are the barriers, right? And what are the enablers, and how we can on ground enhance deployment, right? And that is where we talk about a novel concept of hydrogen portfolio standards, and we abbreviate it as GPS, green hydrogen portfolio standards. And yes, these are the three key questions that we are addressing. We are trying to see whether at present there is an economic case for green hydrogen production, right? And as we know, I mean, I've worked at coal plants all my life. At coal plants, hydrogen is produced from coal, and the cost of producing that hydrogen is somewhere close to $2, $2.50 per kg, right? And that's produced abundantly. I mean, but if we are trying to produce now green hydrogen at almost close to double that cost. We need to see, I mean, how can we take it ahead? You see. Second, if we have to continue doing that, then what are the options we have? That is what we are exploring in the second question, right? And third, given we've still achieved some kind of a subsidy in terms of cost effectiveness, how do we scale that to ensure deployment on the ground? You see, we have to see that we are able to match both producer as well as investors' expectations, right? And that is where I think we probably missed the bus when it was storage, right? We still not able to do everything with VGF alone. We have still not been able to get all our tenders going in terms of storage, and this is where I think we probably need to course correct. So yeah. And I just wanted to highlight upfront the key contributions of our study. So we first evaluate cost competitiveness of green hydrogen over other existing sources such as coal, which I said is close to $2.5, and then also uh, uh, for with gas, right? But remember, in Indian context, when we say coal, most of the coal is without CCUS, right? So that hydrogen which is being produced in India through other sources is relatively dirtier, if I can use that word, in comparison to maybe coal that is being produced maybe in Europe or elsewhere. You see, because we don't have CCUS. So in terms of emissions intensity for the hydrogen that is being produced, it's going to be quite bad. Second part is obviously we find interestingly that green hydrogen in business as usual terms may end up becoming competitive not before 2030, right? So and we then try to figure out, as I mentioned, that how can we then bring this year closer to present years, right? And then we analyzed a few options, and we found that upfront heavily loaded capex subsidy is obviously not only the most intuitive but empirically also stands out to be the most cost effective subsidy option. However, it's only able to cover a part of that subsidy, and that is where we say if we are, as we are trying to cover a part of the subsidy, then capex subsidy upfront is going to do most of the heavy lifting for green hydrogen in India, right? But if we are trying to see that we have to cover the entire gamut, you see, then we need to supplement capex along with other subsidy options such as generation based incentive, right? And that turns out to be then the most effective subsidy option. And finally, as I was alluding to, we are talking about something novel akin to renewable portfolio standards or maybe battery portfolio standards, something which is known as hydrogen portfolio standards. We are mandating the use of hydrogen not only for industries but for utilities and for all the key states and the players, right? Remember, I remember when we wrote the paper on battery storage, we talked about battery portfolio standards. And I am very happy to intimate that the idea of battery portfolio standards was not in vogue, not in regulations. And it was after a year we published that Government of India came out with energy storage obligations. I mean, which is what is also akin to battery portfolio standards. So we might now see hydrogen portfolio standards being implemented not only in spirit but also in letter going forward. That's one of the other unique contributions. I think, I mean, this is there are a few points which are, I think, known to our audience. We are talking about why green hydrogen is very important for India, and I think most of this is known to the audience anyway. I'll talk more about our paper. Can we move ahead? Yeah. Methods, what we're trying to do here is we are trying to levelize the cost of green hydrogen over the life of the underlying asset, right? And then we are also trying to levelize the generation, right, of green hydrogen or the production of green hydrogen, right, again over the life of the asset, right, and over a range of weighted average cost of capital. I'll show some of that. So it's pretty well known, I think, and a robust methodology that is validated empirically through a lot of papers in the past. Yeah, moving ahead, and we have relied. Yes, so the first part related to estimating the levelized cost. The second part relates to analyzing the cost effectiveness. Now, for analyzing the cost effectiveness, we have three main subsidy options that we are analyzing. First, obviously, is the upfront capex subsidy. Second is the generation based incentive, and third is the interest rate subsidy. So there are a couple of other also well known subsidy options, but we are limiting this analysis to the first three because because of two reasons. First, these three options have till now been the bedrock of renewable energy policies in India. So even when it related to solar PV, floating solar, wind energy, and storage, we had capex doing most of the heavy lifting, right? Generation based incentive also has been a key player in devising a lot of policy options, and that has led to grid parity of solar in a big way in India, right? And obviously, in a country where we still have energy access issues, we have to also explore energy interest rate subsidy. The first two are direct in terms of giving payments to the beneficiary or the primary producer, and the last happens to be indirect because in this case, governments or maybe VGF funders give the funding directly to the bankers, right? And they kind of reduce or write off the debt which is levied on to the producers. So that's the range of options we are trying to explore for cost effectiveness. Yeah. And just a bit more as to how capex is for capex. I mean, the idea is we trying to see because electrolyzer for green hydrogen bears the brunt of the cost. We are trying to see if capex subsidy in terms of financial support through a direct grant can help reduce some of the electrolyzer costs, right? Secondly, I mean, if we are able to financially support many of these electrolyzer manufacturing entities, we can also see a lot of learning effect, which is affected through technological breakthroughs. Remember, the learning effect for solar PV in India was close to 30 odd percent, which has led to drastic reduction in tariffs for solar. So, but we have not talked about learning effects for green hydrogen. Most of the policies in India are silent. So we have an implicit assumption that capex subsidy is going to be a key driver for learning effects in green hydrogen. Although, I mean, future studies have to quantify how much of that will be implemented by 2030 in terms of percentage. But I think this is an area of research which can be looked into by future researchers. In contrast, GBI or generation based incentive is starkly different. It incentivizes yearly performance in terms of whatever is being produced by all the developers, right? They get incentivized for their production. So in that sense, it is performance linked. If they end, because at the end of it, you receive direct payments on the basis of your direct energy generation or hydrogen generation or battery storage energy, you see. So the more you produce, the more GBI you get. So it has an incentive of performance directly linked to the kind of subsidy you're offering, and that has played a key role in enhancing the generation percentage of renewable energy also in India. Remember, we were at a stage when we were close to 1-2% of renewable energy penetration in terms of generation close to 2 decades back. Now it is hovering somewhere around 15-20%, even in actual generation terms. And GBI is set to play a key role in that. And finally, as I mentioned, under interest rate subsidy, we are directly reducing the interest burden of the producers, right? Yeah, moving ahead. These are some of the key assumptions. I think this can be, we are trying to also reduce the capex cost during the two blocks of years we have analyzed, right? Also, we have reduced the solar tariff, right, going forward in line with all the key studies in the past. So the idea is we have assumed secular decline in electrolyzer capex cost as well as solar electricity tariff. And remember, we will show you how the levelized cost of green hydrogen is impacted by two. You will find that bulk of the costing of green hydrogen is attributed to the underlying solar electricity tariff. right? As much as good 50% in present value terms as of now is attributed to the cost of generation alone, you see. So, which then implies that how important it is to assume the cost of decline for solar electricity tariff, right? And the second most important factor is obviously the capex. Yeah, these are certain detailed assumptions. We can move ahead. Some more assumptions. Yeah. Yeah. So I would now like to pause for a while and detail on the results here. And as you would see, the results, I mean, are quite interesting. I mean, in present value terms, the levelized cost of green hydrogen without any support hovers close to 4 to 5 US dollars per kg, right? So, and although we are in 2024, these results were somewhere close to the end of 2023. So they are hold very well even now as we speak, right? So we're trying to say that it is still hovering around $4 to 5 per kg. Although we have had claims by some industry experts that it has come down to maybe 4 or maybe 3.5 also in some cases, but I have my fingers crossed on that. However, going forward, we see a decline in levelized cost estimates to 3.5 by a couple of years and to close to 2.5, which is somewhere closer to what is being produced through coal only by 2030. And remember, the two key assumptions here are quite a good decline in capex for electrolyzer and quite a strong secular decline in cost of electricity that is being produced for generating green hydrogen, which is solar. We may see it, but we may not see it as well if we don't find the kind of learning rates you see in electrolyzers efficiency. So there are a few caveats to these results, right? And there are a lot of caveats to the numbers that are being touted around the industry, right? $3 4, and I also came across a number which is close to $1 by 2030. Totally surprised. I don't know. I mean, how much learning rate they are envisaging by in a matter of 6 years. And I was, as I was alluding to, if you would see towards the right, we have three pie charts. We are trying to see at present, which is close to 2023, what has been the contribution of the key elements in the levelized costing. And as we would see, it's close to good 50% for electricity. So, and a good one third to capex alone, and then the O&M expenses are only as little as 15%, which means in presently good 85% is by two major components, right? And this only exacerbates as we go forward. I mean, in 2025 this is close to 90%, and by 2030 this is over 90%, which means these are two key areas of concern for us. I mean, and this is where one of our earlier papers, which we published in the Electricity Journal, where we talked about not only focusing on deployment but also focusing on development. So at developmental stage, if we are also putting R&D efforts to see that we are able to generate the kind of learning effects in reducing the costing and increasing the efficiency, we would be reducing the cost of green hydrogen faster, because we don't have a number of different levers to control. What we need to control are two key levers. What we need to focus on are two key levers at developmental stage. I have my own doubts as to how much efforts or how focused efforts are at R&D level to enhance learning effects in these two different areas, different but related areas. But the other important element here also is to see that by 2030, when we see the costing might come down to some competitive level, we still would require 60-65% to be covered through subsidized solar. And there are policy now changes happening which might reduce the level of subsidy that is being offered to solar now going forward. So, I mean, I have my own doubts as to whether we will be able to achieve this 2.5 number without the kind of support that is being offered to solar, right? So although I'm trying to say the numbers for LCOH here do not have inherent subsidy for green hydrogen, but it has inbuilt subsidy for the underlying solar tariff, right? So that is one caveat we'll have to go ahead with. Yeah. Can we move ahead, please? Yeah. So here we are trying to see how our costing for green hydrogen compares vis-a-vis other sources of hydrogen production in India. And as I said, 2.20 is hydrogen that is being produced through coal, which comes around somewhere close to 200 rupees per kg, right, in India. As I mentioned, I worked at coal plants all my life. We produce hydrogen with our hands. We have seen it as, I mean, and this is without CCUS. With CCUS, we usually say it jacks up by around good 50 paisa. So, which is coming closer to 2 rupees 70 paisa. So, we have then a task on our hands. We have to come down for any kind of competitiveness from 4.45 to 2.20, right? And that is what we've tried analyzing when we say cost effectiveness. So we're trying to say we are mapping cost effectiveness in terms of bringing the cost of green hydrogen to the cost of gray hydrogen, right? I'm not using the word gray here for a reason, because as I say, in Indian context, it's not as gray as it is in the European context. It tends to be black, I would say, right? So the idea, and I mean, there is very little gas, very little hydrogen that is being produced through natural gas, although we also have this number assigned here to it. So yeah, moving ahead. Just wanted to check with you, Shweta, how much time do we have? I have rather.
Sorry, it took me a while to figure it. I think we can continue with your slides. We have. Then yeah.
Yeah. So I'll take another, I think, 5-10 minutes. Yeah. So I mean, what we also tried doing is we sensitized the cost of producing green hydrogen to a number of different weighted average cost of capital. And we tried seeing, I mean, as I mentioned, beyond the two identified levers, which is capex of electrolyzer and the cost of underlying solar electricity, right? Is there additional lever which has a significant impact on the levelized cost for green hydrogen? I mean, the top line is what is happening. I mean, yeah, is what is happening as of now, right? We I mean, somewhere for a weighted average capital cost of weighted average cost of capital for 10%, we have the levelized cost of hydrogen at around 4.36. We had 4.45 when it was even higher, which was close to 12%, right? So it comes down to 4.36 for 10%, right? And it comes down secularly as we reduce the cost of capital. And that is quite intuitive, right? But interestingly, the impact is relatively smaller, right, when we move to longer time horizons. And the impact almost vanishes when we come to 2030, right? And the idea here is very, very interesting. I mean, probably cost of capital might just become closer to insignificant, right, in 2030. And what remains significant is the cost of electrolyzer and the cost of electricity, you see. And the whole idea of uh, reducing the cost of capital and all that stuff then becomes relatively less important. I mean, so, although it remains to be analyzed in much greater detail as to what are then the kind of levers which will additionally impact in 2030, we've not done that, but that is something we're trying to do in our future work. So this was something very interesting. So although there is a case for reducing the cost of capital to scale green hydrogen at present, but that may not be so in 2030. So we also have a limited opportunity of good 5, 6, 7 years to reduce the cost of capital. Beyond that, even the cost of capital will not have a significant impact on the levelized cost. Yeah, moving ahead. Yeah. So this is where then we try to see how do we then reduce costs, right? And we try doing that by analyzing these three interesting options, and we found that even if we kind of zero all the capex, right, we will still not be able to entirely cover the cost subsidy. And when I say here the cost subsidy, remember we are trying to bring down the cost of hydrogen from 4.45 to 2.20, which is close to 2.25 USD per kg. So that much is the kind of amount we need to build in through policy instruments for full coverage, right? We can't do that entirely through capex alone, right? We could do it by entirely making capex zero only to cover as much as 88%, right? But we can do that by using GBI, right? But then GBI is one of the most costliest options we found out. And what we did was we had built financial models. We built financial models for the life of the asset yearly. We had built in capex, we had built in GBI, then we did a present value estimation for each of these options. We found out in present value terms which option among the three offers us the least NPV, and that happens to be the most cost effective option. For instance, capex offers us the most least NPV, right? And that happens to be then the most cost effective option, right? While GBI happens to give us a very high NPV, which means it happens to be the least cost effective option. The third part and the most important aspect here is interest rate subsidy is only able to cover as much as 38%, which is not more than a good one third, right, of the kind of policy support that is needed to make green hydrogen cost effective, right? Which means it alone cannot be an instrument for scaling green hydrogen in India. So when we hear about talks of reducing the cost of capital or the cost of debt also, right, we need to take it with a pinch of salt. These might end up being only, I would say, cosmetic, right? What we need is more of a per kg incentive in terms of GBI, or maybe an upfront incentive in terms of a capex. Yeah. But what we actually need is a combination of options, because we need to achieve 100% viability gap coverage, which is in this case close to 2.5 rupees. You see, we need to come down from 4.45 to 2.20, right? And we found out if we couple capex, and we need to couple capex because capex is only covering some 88% with GBI, right? Then we are able to get the most cost effective option, right? But if in case we are not able to have capex as a key policy lever, then we probably need to couple GBI with interest rate subsidy, right? Because GBI alone is said to be the most expensive and the least effective. So I mean, through this now study, we have some kind of an idea as to which policy option is better suited for green hydrogen. We found out that probably capex, which is upfront, and GBI, which is long term till the life of the asset, coupled, right, will make the cost of subsidy the least in present value terms, right? And probably is the best way going forward. But remember, capex requires upfront investment. It requires deep pockets. It requires a lot of generosity. While GBI requires a lot of consistent effort, which has to be kind of done by governments across states, right? So the it also puts into place a bigger challenge, right? I mean, you remember GBI is unpopular, IS is very popular. You see, very populist rather. It makes very good headlines. I mean, reducing debt, waiving debt off, right, for all players. But that we found out it's second in terms of cost effectiveness. And if you see, the margin is fairly huge. You see, So the idea is we have now been able to assess, you see, the cost effectiveness and the priorities in pure economic terms. And remember, if we are only trying to go easy, which we did to some extent with wind, you see, we gave a GBI, right, generous GBI to get with parity. We have still not been able to get the kind of tariffs we got for solar, right? Wind is still one of the most expensive options, even after 20 years, you see. And I attribute most of the issues related to GBI alone, because GBI did play its role, and I mean probably we can figure out why. Because even after 100% viability gap coverage, it happens to be a costlier option. Yeah, moving ahead.
Yeah. Abhinav, if we can wrap this in 2 minutes, then I would love to also ask some lovely questions related to what your findings are.
Wonderful. So I think, yeah, I think we've discussed. I mean, obviously, capex not only reduces LCOH due to its front loading effect, it also, as I said, leads to a lot of learning effect, right? Particularly for a fledgling but a promising industry like green hydrogen. Capex is exactly what the doctor has ordered. GBI, as I feel, is going to be a very, very important player, but it requires consistent efforts, right? It also has a very important element of incentivizing production. This is where we could marry maybe producers and also investors. We always think about investors, rarely we think about producers. If we are incentivizing producers, then only we will be able to deploy at scale. So probably in our sight of cost effectiveness, we shouldn't lose out GBI, although it happens to be expensive. And finally, the only problem I have with IES is there are incentives not only to producers and developers and investors, it ends up providing incentives to givers because it is populist. You see, so I have my own apprehensions when it comes to IS, but I mean, with some amount of calibration, it could still serve as an important lever in reducing cost in the long run. Moving ahead. And as I mentioned, we've talked about mandating the use of hydrogen not only by industries and states, and we have based our argument um, on survey across countries. Shweta, you mentioned how EU has an EU hydrogen strategy. I think Weber is going to talk about it. We also have US, Japan, South Korea, and a number of other countries which have some kind of targets, right? Although these targets may not be quantified in quantity terms, but they have still mandated cost targets. You see, US is saying that they want to somehow bring down the cost to $1 per kg. You see, so what we are trying to say is there are a number of targets which are across prevalent across the globe, and probably we need to move faster towards those targets. Yeah, I think yeah. So I think that is pretty evident. Yeah, we've talked about it. Yeah, done. Go ahead. Yeah, finally, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Abhinav, for that comprehensive insight into the green hydrogen perspective in India. I think some of the findings are pretty interesting, especially when you're looking at the fact that cost of capital is not going to be the bigger problem for green hydrogen. I think that's a great finding as opposed to our traditional understanding when we're looking at other technologies that have emerged over the last decade or so. But of course, there is a sort of a cross-sectorial impact, as you have rightly pointed out, that the cost of generation is going to be crucial. So that means if you're going to be depending on the way the solar industry is going to flourish for us to be able to determine prices in green hydrogen sector for India, then that codependency needs to be addressed. Whether there would be sort of a policy favoritism or not is something that we will figure out. Particularly now because we're expecting renewables to be competitive on their own and governments are in the mode of pulling away from subsidies. So it's going to be a very interesting junction. I think your graph very beautifully lays that out. Um, and I'm super happy to also know that we have our own WACC numbers for green hydrogen that we can plug in. I think that those are difficult to come by when you have to do financial modeling. So that's good to know for all other research people in the community that we have slowly coming down, but nonetheless, that's not the key determinant factor. So I think on that note, I'm going to pivot to Vaibhav. Vaibhav, you're sitting on the crossroads of how the Indian green hydrogen sector is trying to cross collaborate with the European green hydrogen sector. And there is a lot of interest and synergies that are emerging, particularly over the last 1 year with different member states from EU. So could you throw some light on how India and Europe are positioned in terms of collaborating on green hydrogen? And do we see that sort of impacting some of the numbers that Abhinav has indicated to us?
Oh, thank you. Thank you, Shweta. Shweta, just a confirmation, am I audible? Perfect. So, firstly, I mean, thanks to Pavina for setting a good context. Half of my job is done here in terms of what all needs to be done. So, he has covered all of that while also specifying the measures to do so. In terms of what's happening in Europe and how India and EU have been collaborating, so I can touch upon that initially. And subsequently, I mean, if there are any other questions or any points you may want to discuss in detail, I can take that opportunity to do so. So, in terms of green hydrogen relevance, if you look at Europe and India, there is that complementarity because the intent is that, for example, the electrolyzer technology and those players would be coming in from Europe. So, if the generation for green hydrogen is going to be happening here in India, that technology and providers primarily would be from, say, Europe. Given the lower cost of generation for renewable energy in India, the green hydrogen generation, and also given the sites here for solar and wind, the generation may happen here, and subsequently, once it's generated, then export from India could be to Europe. So that way, there is this mutual partnership, and both get to benefit from this because not one region, I mean, would be a net importer or net exporter. There would be some imbalances, but however, there is this complementarity because of such a prima facie arrangement. Uh, EU is also very clear on that front that they would have to be importing green hydrogen in order to be able to achieve Fit for 55 and other targets. There would have to be a net import of green hydrogen that may happen. However, that import can happen from any region that's going to be supplying competitively. So, if you also look at the recent Hinco tender, they wanted competitive supply of green ammonia. In that tender, two of the Indian consortiums also participated. However, they couldn't emerge to be the most competitive. The pricing was somewhere close to 1100. I think while the tender result has discovered a pricing of close to 890, I think. So it indicates that Indian companies need a lot to do. And that also takes me back to what Abhinav was discussing, some measures that could come in to ensure India can be competitive so that these global uh, procurement would offer some significant or substantial chance to India also to supply. Otherwise, in terms of what EU plans to do is the overarching theme is to have green emission reduction that has to happen 55% by 2030 to achieve a net neutrality by 2050. And transportation and these heavy or hard to abate sectors, uh, they have been recognized as focus areas. That includes industry, that includes aviation, that also includes, for example, shipping. Shipping also is crucial. So, as part of fuel EU mandate or ETS, uh, for vessels, I mean, it's going to be a priority. Now, for that to happen, there's also a theme that for these, so for example, refueling can happen here in India, while these vessels, I mean, they continue transporting cargo, I mean, from one region to the other, and that's where the competitiveness again comes into picture. So if it's going to be India that's more competitive, it may make sense to refuel here in India. If not, I mean, the other countries or other regions would also be competing here in India. So broadly, these have been some overarching themes or principles. Uh, so the intent is both get to benefit, both should be leveraging the competencies that remains, and both should finally be achieving their net zero target and other benefits that they likely foresee from this.
Thank you, Vaibhav. I think you highlighted a very interesting fact that India can actually serve as that inter-exchange for shipping routes, given that we have such a vast coastline. And coincidentally, a lot of our renewable rich states are also across the coastline. So in terms of creating these hydrogen hubs and being able to sort of plug into that ecosystem is a whole another study and that could be done and put across as an opportunity for a business model or a case. But I think before I have my two questions to ask each of you, probably I'll invite Lucilla first to ask her questions, and then I would circle back to what I have to ask. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Sweta. Thank you so much, Abhinav, for a wonderful presentation and for writing such a clear paper. Even myself, I'm not considering myself an expert in hydrogen, nor an engineer. I'm a lawyer by education. I'm a professor of law. It went through for me extremely clear. So congratulations. And this is exactly the type of paper you wanted to advance the debate. I have actually questions that are from a non-expert, so pardon from my side if it was they were not quite interesting questions. I hope not. But I think if it's a matter of more clarifications, I think very connected to what Sweta just mentioned when you come to cost. By reading your paper, you are clear that actually when you develop the cost assessment, you are taking in consideration that this hydrogen would be located close to certain areas and more in particular industrial areas. And one thing that is always, at least in Europe, the debate of hydrogen is almost disassociated. It's impossible to disassociate it with the cost of transportation. Whether if you are importing in the ship transportation, whether it's you're speaking about building an infrastructure as a pipelines, or if you are speaking about upgrading the pipelines, gas pipelines that we have it. But it's associated. I don't know to what extent it was you didn't in the papers clear you didn't take it in consideration. But if you're supposed to take it in consideration, what could be the costs and there. And my another question is it's more on the sense that I would say on the skeptical, not necessarily the skeptical side, but when you were speaking about subsidization process and chooses for subsidization, and especially when you bring in capex, to what extent, what are the risks, for instance, because especially when you're speaking about hydrogen, which the demand is still very uncertain, to what extent you bring in capex and in itself, by only itself, who could hold the risks of having a capex subsidization in a process in which the demand is still very uncertain? Is the government and or the private finance, or you see like publicly-private financing involving on this risk? But how you would distribute the risks in this regard? But I think these were my two questions.
Maybe Abhinav, you can go first. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you, Lucilla. I mean, for your insightful observations. I'm happy that you found value in the paper, and your questions, in fact, are themselves quite insightful. So, and given us a lot of food for thought already. So, thank you for your questions as well. Can I answer your second question first?
Okay, go ahead.
So, your second question, so the idea of capex doing most of the heavy lifting, as I usually say, right? Or if I can put it in other words, capex punching beyond its weight. As you see, capex is not even able to cover the entire coverage, right? Viability gap coverage, but still we are trying to leverage capex, right? Bones out of two key reasons. First, it has already been successful policy instrument when it was solar, right? And when it was wind, we had allowed accelerated depreciation for the heavy capex, right? I think you're aware of that, right? But as you rightly pointed out, green hydrogen is a fledgling and a nascent industry, right? There are inherent risks. There are more skeptics and naysayers than even the developers and producers on ground. You see, so we need to calibrate not just our moves but also the policies, right? But you see, in India, and we are working on a paper now with some folks where we're trying to see Indian renewable energy transition has been, although there is no IRA in India, there is no EU Green Deal, but this has been mostly a state led transition. Uh, Mostly in a very, I would say, camouflaged way. You see, the Indian exchequer doesn't dole out money like IRA, but the Indian exchequer stands firmly behind the firms, developers, because they have a lot of state owned enterprises. You already have performance linked incentive PLI schemes across the board. They are doing wonders for the our battery storage, you see. So we might see a PLI for capex also, I'm trying to say. So the idea will be they'll break this capex subsidy down in a different of components. PLI will take some part, right? There will be another round of PLI in some other ways, and then probably we could move ahead. And this I mean, a bit of de-risking, right, will be done through performance, right? As you know, PLI has an inbuilt performance component. Developers of capex who are able to develop, they will get the incentive based on their performance alone. The ones who are laggards, they will be ironed out. So that's one way I think of it, but I don't have a complete answer to your question. But you see, capex subsidy is not the only elephant in the room. The other elephant is also, and I think a bigger elephant is what Shweta also alluded to, the costing for renewable energy. And slowly but surely, we'll see that petering out, you see, in terms of subsidy. So, what we'll see is, will green hydrogen be able to stand on its own foot? I mean, or rather, feet when that happens? And that's not going to happen very far. So, I mean, I'll stop there in terms of the second question. The first question, obviously, as you said, I mean, we focused on hydrogen production, the in terms of the scope of the study. And as I said, I mean, while working at coal plants, I used to see getting generated hydrogen. You see, and my idea was in that location itself, right? If you produce green hydrogen, and what we have started doing now in a number of utilities in India, right, both state and private owned, we've started now retiring some of the coal plants and repurposing them with renewable assets, right? So what we have is coal asset on the one hand and solar asset on the other hand, and then we can have green hydrogen production alongside grey hydrogen production. And we already have the transportation network to some extent in those clusters, which can be repurposed to utilize some of the green hydrogen transportation infrastructure. That has been the large definition and contour of our study. Although, yes, I agree, when the entire economy for green hydrogen comes, we need to scale that up. We need to build that into the costing part, and that is going to be monstrous, and that will be very challenging. But I mean, we will have to start somewhere. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Abhinav. Maybe Vaibhav, before I give you the floor, I'll add my two questions to the mix. So I think Abhinav did bring out something very interesting, which is hydrogen portfolio standards, and I think probably some version of that would be required if we were to meet our own national goals, and also if we want to sort of cater to the export oriented market that we want. So do we see sort of a green hydrogen certification program coming in to authenticate it between the blacks to the green? And how will that sort of flourish in a heavily thermal system like ours? That would be more important to sort of have off-takers' confidence in what we are doing. And second is the electrolyzer manufacturing industry in India is also still quite nascent, right? So, so the calculations, Abhinav, that you have for 2030, is it all dependent on import of these technologies, or does it also factor in that we would set up our own domestic hubs to be able to cost competitively first produce the electrolyzer, then produce the green hydrogen, and then probably a future hint for a paper that which you can extend is, if we were to then have it as green ammonia, what would be the cost implications? So yeah, so maybe Vaibhav you can take, and then Abhinav, yeah.
Sure. Thanks, Shweta. I'll try to answer both, and I'll also welcome other panelists to correct me or to add on. Uh, when we look at, for example, for this transition to happen for green hydrogen to be competitive, a lot of things would have to fall into place. Uh, on the electrolyzer side, efficiencies have to go up, cost effectiveness has to be there, energy consumption has to be lowered, cost of production has to go down. Then the energy part, Abhinav also mentioned, the major component within green hydrogen generation happens to be uh, green energy. That has to come down. For that, the prices for solar have to come down. Price for wind, importantly, would have to come down. That has not fallen. For solar, we have seen a falling trajectory. For wind, that's still to be seen. And batteries also would have to be further going down in terms of their pricing, in terms of levelized cost of storage. So a lot has to happen, and apart from that, there would have to be more done in terms of technology, in terms of capital, in terms of standards, in terms of skilling, so on and so forth. What interestingly happened in India was, so for example, we had the PLI for electrolyzer manufacturing. We also had the PLI for end production of green hydrogen. So over there, what we have seen is, what we have observed is, when people were bidding for electrolyzer production, they were targeting certain offtake. When people are bidding for green hydrogen generation, they also looked at the electrolyzer capacity that's going to be coming live, also tendered out under PLI. Now, since that offtake part has not happened, so now both are on both the side, there is a bit of uncertainty. So how do you manufacture so much electrolyzer if no one is going to consume those, if no one is going to procure those? At the same time, I mean, if it's not getting competitive, offtake is not there, then green hydrogen production from a generation standpoint also takes side. So these uncertainties come in. Another development that has been happening is, and that's also quite major, uh, that India is relying and focusing a lot on green hydrogen only. So while, for example, there are options, blue, gray, everything, but within policymakers, there is almost a consensus that focus has to be on green part only. So while Europe wants to still look at everything, evaluate everything, within India, the intent remains very clear that, I mean, it would have to be green hydrogen. Why so? Because it fits in two or three requirements. First is, India is specifically focusing on domestic manufacturing, make in India. So, and green hydrogen is a gateway to that. Manufacturing of green hydrogen or generation of green hydrogen, also for all the renewable energy that capacity that comes up, then deployment of that greener capacity, and also for all of this greener capacity, having modules and wind turbines and batteries that are manufactured domestically. So, if you, for example, generate green hydrogen, then throughout the value chain, these deployment and manufacturing options come alive. And that has been the intent, to ensure that, I mean, the economy also gets to benefit. There is an intent to focus on all of this, which is why when you look at PLI, you see PLI that has been there for solar module manufacturing and cell manufacturing and wafers and ingots. You see PLI that's also there for lithium ion cells. And you see PLI that's also there for electrolyzer and green hydrogen. So the intent is that for larger renewable generation to happen, I mean, manufacturing has to be there, which India definitely wants, and also competitiveness has to be also ascertained. So which is why the focus entirely is on green hydrogen, while often emitting and while not deliberating much upon other options.
No, thanks, Vaibhav, for highlighting that. But from what you're saying, there also seems to be an opportunity for blue hydrogen, particularly with the Indian gas sector going to expand with its 2040 vision. So we will sort of see that emergence. And if Abhinav's calculations are to go by, then the blue hydrogen numbers are nowhere close to where the green hydrogen will compete with. It's doing even better than the black hydrogen. So it also again depends on how the natural gas sector in India will sort of flourish to be able to leverage that cost competitiveness that blue hydrogen brings in. Probably that is something I'm not sure, but other geographies like Japan and South Korea are looking at. I'm not sure, but maybe it's a discussion for another day. But I'll give the floor back to you, Abhinav, to comment on the HPS and the green certification. because that would link to what the off-taker aspect that Vaibhav also brought along.
So, I mean, we're trying to say that obviously cost subsidization is important, obviously deployment is important, but we also need to think about the developer. He needs to have a certainty about demand. I mean, certainty not only on paper but also on ground. I mean, which is not just going to reduce the cost of capital, which may be important or may not be important, but which gives him the kind of confidence. And because I mean, investor, you see, he and the developer, they have an opportunity cost. I mean, they would rather go for projects which give them higher returns, I mean, and which gives them lesser risks. So to them, if a certain part of their demand is considered and recognized, so they will be keen. So in terms of mandating demand targets, this is going to be an imperative. And this also answers Lucilla questions as to how we can de-risk some of that. I mean, this is one way you could significantly de-risk some of the bigger risks associated with green hydrogen. So I'll stop here, but the idea is obviously there are a whole gamut of issues which require a bigger, larger discussion.
Well, thanks, Abhinav. I think what this debate has done is it's opened up those can of worms that we need to address. And I think as Vaibhav also mentioned, we have a lot of catch-22 situations which we need to overcome for us to meet our own national targets as well as cater to the international market. But there's a lot of opportunity given our own 500 gigawatt goals and others that are all complementing this larger vision. So on that note, probably I will, given that we have also surpassed our time, I will call this towards the end of the debate because I do not want to also hold Abhinav and Vaibhav, given that we are at the eve of Diwali, one of the major festivals here. So I will let all of us get back to our families. And I would like to thank you, Abhinav, for this wonderful paper once again, which we will also dig in deeper through other modes of engagement, and Vaibhav for throwing light on the EU India cooperation. And thanks, Lucilla, for co-hosting with me. So with that, a very good afternoon and good evening to everyone. Do follow us for the next upcoming debate on FSR Talks, which will be from the African School of Regulation.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Shweta.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Jesus.